My name is Serafina Ashwood, and before you judge me for what I'm about to tell you, I need you to understand something. Fairy tales are real, not in the way you think, not with magic wands and singing mice, but in ways that are infinitely more dangerous, more beautiful, and more terrifying than any storybook could ever capture. This is my story, a story of loss, betrayal, transformation, and a love that literally defied death itself. But more than that, it's a story about discovering that everything you thought you knew about yourself was a carefully constructed lie, and that the truth waiting beneath that lie was more extraordinary than you could have ever imagined. I need to start at the beginning, before everything changed, before I understood what I truly was. I need you to see who I was so you can understand the magnitude of what I became. When I was 22 years old, I believed I knew exactly who I was. I was the daughter of Jonathan Ashwood, an antiques dealer with an obsession for rare manuscripts and unusual artifacts. I was a recent college graduate with dreams of becoming an art historian, someone who wanted to spend her life surrounded by beautiful things and uncovering the stories they held. I was someone who believed in logic, science, and the tangible world I could see and touch. I had spent my entire childhood in our Victorian mansion on Nightfall Avenue, a house that felt like it had been plucked from another century and dropped into the modern world. The house was filled with my father's collections, rooms upon rooms of artifacts, books, and curiosities that he had gathered from all over the world. As a child, I thought every house was like this, that every father came home from business trips with ancient scrolls and mysterious objects wrapped in cloth. My mother died when I was 3 years old. I have only fragments of memories of her. The scent of lavender, the sound of her laugh, the feeling of being held and completely safe. My father rarely spoke about her, and when he did, his eyes would take on a distant quality, as if he were looking at something I couldn't see. He kept one photograph of her on his desk, a striking woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Growing up, it was just my father and me. He homeschooled me until I was 12, teaching me languages I didn't know anyone actually spoke, history that didn't match what I later learned in regular school, and skills that seemed arcane and useless. He taught me to identify authentic artifacts from forgeries, to read ancient texts in their original languages, to understand the cultural context that gave objects their true meaning. Looking back, I realize he was preparing me for a life I didn't know existed. But at the time, I just thought my father was eccentric, brilliant in his way, but perhaps a little too obsessed with the past. When I finally attended regular school, I struggled to fit in. I knew things other children didn't know, and I didn't know things they took for granted. I could read Latin but couldn't follow popular television shows. I could authenticate Renaissance paintings, but didn't understand social media. I was always slightly out of step with my peers, never quite belonging anywhere. College was supposed to change that. I went to study art history at a prestigious university 3 hours from home, determined to finally find my place in the world. And for 4 years, I almost succeeded. I made friends, dated casually, discovered that I actually enjoyed being around people my own age. I was building a life that felt normal, ordinary, mine. Then, in my final semester, everything fell apart. I was wrong about everything. My father died on a rainy Tuesday in October, and with him went every certainty I had ever known. The illness came suddenly, viciously, giving us barely 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. The doctors called it an aggressive cancer, something that had apparently been growing silently for years before suddenly exploding into every system of his body. I dropped everything and came home immediately. My professors were understanding, allowing me to finish my coursework remotely. My friends promised to visit, though most never did. Suddenly, my entire world contracted to the walls of our Victorian mansion and the steady, horrifying decline of the only parent I had ever really known. Those 6 weeks were the longest and shortest of my life. I watched my father transform from a vibrant, energetic man in his apparent 50s to something gaunt and fragile. He lost weight rapidly, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that no amount of medical intervention seemed to help. The doctors were baffled by how quickly he deteriorated, by symptoms that didn't quite match any known progression of the disease they had diagnosed. During those final days, as the morphine took hold and reality blurred for him, my father tried desperately to tell me things. He would grip my hand with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly lucid and urgent, and he would whisper about my heritage, about who I really was, about dangers I needed to understand. He told me that I wasn't entirely human, that my mother had been something else, something extraordinary. He said that there were people who would want to find me, to study me, to use me for purposes I couldn't imagine. He begged me to read his journals, to understand the world he had kept hidden from me for my own protection. He tried to explain about the artifacts in his collection, about which ones were merely valuable and which ones held genuine power. He attempted to give me names of people I could trust, contacts in a community I didn't know existed. He insisted that when certain things started happening to me, I shouldn't be afraid, that it was natural, that it was my birthright. But the morphine made his words confused, disjointed, and I dismissed them as fever dreams brought on by medication and approaching death. I thought he was hallucinating, that the cancer had spread to his brain and was causing delusions. I held his hand, told him I understood, promised him I would be safe, all while believing that none of what he was saying was real. I would later realize that every single word had been true, and my dismissal of his warnings nearly cost me everything. On that Tuesday in October, my father died at 3:47 in the morning. I was holding his hand, and I felt the exact moment his life left him. It wasn't peaceful like they show in movies. It was brutal and real and final. One moment he was there, struggling to breathe, fighting to stay long enough to tell me one more crucial thing. The next moment, he was gone, and I was completely alone. The grief hit me like a physical force. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't imagine how I was supposed to continue existing in a world that no longer contained my father. He had been my constant, my anchor, the one person who truly understood me even when I didn't understand myself. Now he was gone, and I had no idea how to navigate the world without him. The funeral was held on a gray Friday morning, the kind of day where the sky seems to press down on you, heavy with unspilled rain. I arranged everything myself, choosing readings my father would have appreciated, selecting music that reminded me of quiet evenings in his study. The funeral home handled the logistics, but every decision felt impossibly heavy, weighted with finality. The service was small, intimate, just the way my father would have wanted. I had expected only a handful of attendees, a few business associates, maybe some distant relatives I barely remembered, perhaps a neighbor or two who had known my father casually. What I didn't expect was the extraordinary collection of people who appeared that morning. They arrived separately, but seemed to know each other, exchanging subtle nods of recognition as they took their seats. They were elegant, impeccably dressed in expensive dark clothing that managed to be both respectful and somehow timeless in style. Men in perfectly tailored suits that could have come from any decade. Women in dresses that were modern yet somehow classical. But it was their presence that truly caught my attention. They had an aura about them, a quality I couldn't quite name. When they moved, it was with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. When they spoke, their voices were cultured, educated, carrying accents I couldn't quite place, and they watched me. Not obviously, not rudely, but with an intensity that made my skin prickle with awareness. I would catch them observing me from across the room, their gazes assessing, measuring, calculating something I didn't understand. During the service, several of them approached to offer condolences. They introduced themselves with names that sounded vaguely European: Lucian Nightshade, Vivian Darkwater, Cassandra Thornfield, Adrian Moonwood. They spoke about my father with genuine affection and respect, sharing anecdotes that revealed depths to his life I had never suspected. Lucian Nightshade, a tall man with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that seemed to see through me, told me that my father had been one of the finest scholars he had ever known. He spoke about my father's contributions to preserving historical knowledge, about his unique ability to bridge different communities and perspectives. Vivian Darkwater, a striking woman with red hair and porcelain skin, mentioned that my father had been instrumental in her own understanding of certain cultural traditions. She said that his loss would be felt deeply by many people, in many places, in ways that might not be immediately apparent. Cassandra Thornfield, whose dark eyes held centuries of sadness, touched my hand briefly and told me that my father had spoken of me often, with tremendous pride and love. She said that he had been preparing something important for me, and that when I was ready, I would find what I needed. Each of them seemed to be trying to tell me something beyond their actual words, communicating in a language I didn't yet speak. Their eyes held knowledge, sympathy, and something that looked remarkably like concern. But what truly unsettled me was their physical presence. In the gray morning light filtering through the funeral home's windows, their skin seemed to have an unusual luminosity, a quality that went beyond good genetics or expensive skincare. Their movements were too smooth, too precise. And when they spoke, I occasionally caught glimpses of teeth that seemed just slightly too sharp, too perfect. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was playing tricks with my perception. I was exhausted, emotionally devastated, not thinking clearly. Of course, these people looked unusual. I was looking at everything through the distorted lens of profound loss. But some primal part of my brain, some instinct that operated below conscious thought, was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. These people were not entirely human. They were something other, something that defied normal categorization. After the service, as the attendees filed out, several of them left cards with contact information. They told me to reach out if I needed anything, if I had questions, if I ever wanted to know more about my father's work. Their offers seemed genuine, but there was an undercurrent of urgency that I didn't understand. The last to leave was a man who hadn't introduced himself during the service. He was tall, with dark hair and eyes that held unfathomable depth. He approached me as I stood alone by my father's casket, taking a final private moment before they closed it forever. He didn't offer platitudes or empty sympathies. Instead, he simply said that my father had been one of his closest friends for longer than I could imagine, and that Jonathan Ashwood had died knowing his daughter would be protected and guided when the time came. Then he placed something in my hand, a small antique key with an unusual design. He told me it would open what I needed to find when I was ready to look. His eyes held a mixture of sympathy and something that looked like anticipation, as if he knew what was coming for me and understood how difficult it would be. Before I could ask him any questions, he was gone, disappearing into the gray morning with the same fluid grace all the other unusual attendees had displayed. I stood there, holding that mysterious key, feeling like I had just attended a funeral for a stranger rather than my father. Who were these people? How had they known him? And why did every instinct I possessed tell me that my father's death had revealed something far more complex than I had ever imagined? 3 weeks after the funeral, I was beginning to find some semblance of routine in my grief. I woke each morning in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by familiar things that now felt strange without my father's presence in the house. I went through the motions of living, eating meals I didn't taste, sorting through paperwork, trying to figure out how to manage my father's business and estate. The lawyer had scheduled a formal reading of the will for the following month. In the meantime, I tried to maintain the house and business as my father would have wanted. I opened the shop 3 days a week, dealing with customers who wanted to browse the artifacts and antiquities my father had spent decades collecting. Most days were quiet, giving me too much time to think, to remember, to grieve. Then, on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the funeral, everything changed. I was in the kitchen, forcing myself to eat breakfast, when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. The few friends who had initially reached out had gradually returned to their own lives, and I had stopped answering most calls or messages. I considered ignoring it, but something made me get up and answer the door. Standing on my front porch was a woman I had never seen before, though something about her felt vaguely familiar. She was probably in her early 50s, impeccably dressed in designer clothing that screamed wealth and sophistication. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her makeup flawless, her jewelry expensive but understated. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to getting exactly what she wanted. Behind her stood 2 younger women, clearly her daughters. Both were beautiful in a manufactured way, with the kind of polished perfection that comes from endless hours at salons and spas. They looked at me with expressions that managed to be both sympathetic and somehow superior. The woman introduced herself as Cordelia Ravencrest, and she claimed to be my father's widow. I actually laughed. The idea was absurd. My father hadn't been married. He hadn't even dated, as far as I knew. He had been completely devoted to his work and to raising me. The suggestion that he had secretly married someone was ridiculous, but Cordelia remained calm, unfazed by my reaction. She reached into her expensive handbag and produced a marriage certificate, official, and legal, dated 6 months before my father's death. She explained that she and my father had met at an antiquities auction 2 years earlier, had developed a friendship that slowly became something more, and had finally married in a quiet civil ceremony during one of his business trips to Europe. I stared at the document, seeing my father's signature, seeing the official stamps and seals that made it legitimate. The certificate was real. The marriage had been legal, and I had known nothing about it. Cordelia saw my shock, and her expression softened into something that almost looked like sympathy. She explained that my father had been very private about his personal life, that he had wanted to wait until the time was right to tell me about their relationship. They had been planning to have a family dinner where he would introduce us properly, but then his illness had progressed so quickly that there had never been an appropriate moment. She told me she had attended the funeral, though she had stayed in the background out of respect for my grief. She had wanted to give me time to process my loss before introducing herself and complicating an already difficult situation. Now, however, there were practical matters that needed to be addressed. As my father's legal widow, she had certain rights to his estate. She wasn't trying to take everything from me, she assured me. She just wanted what was legally and rightfully hers. She brought with her 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Isadora and Evangeline Ravencrest. Isadora was the elder, 25, with aspirations of becoming a socialite and marrying well. Evangeline was 23, my age, with interests in art and culture that she pursued with the enthusiasm of someone who had never had to worry about practical concerns, like earning a living. Both daughters greeted me with carefully practiced sympathy, offering condolences that sounded rehearsed and hollow. They looked at me with a combination of pity and assessment, clearly trying to figure out where I fit into their suddenly expanded family structure. Cordelia suggested that we all sit down and discuss the situation like civilized adults. She had consulted with lawyers, she explained, and the legal situation was complex. As my father's widow, she was entitled to half of everything he owned: the house, the business, his collections, his investments. However, she wasn't interested in forcing a sale or creating unnecessary conflict. Instead, she proposed that we all live together in the house, which was certainly large enough to accommodate everyone comfortably. We could share responsibilities, pool our resources, and support each other through this difficult transition. She emphasized that she had loved my father deeply and wanted to honor his memory by creating a family environment that he would have appreciated. I should have been more suspicious. I should have questioned why my father had never mentioned this marriage, why he hadn't introduced me to Cordelia during his illness, why everything about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. But I was grieving, exhausted, and completely overwhelmed. The idea of not having to manage everything alone, of having other people to share the burden of the house and business, seemed almost appealing, and I wanted desperately to believe that my father had found happiness in his final years, that he hadn't been completely alone during those last months. So I agreed. I welcomed Cordelia and her daughters into my home, never imagining that I was inviting in the people who would systematically destroy everything I had left. The change didn't happen immediately. For the first few weeks, Cordelia and her daughters were models of consideration and sympathy. They gave me space to grieve, offered to help with household tasks, and generally presented themselves as supportive family members who genuinely cared about my well-being. Cordelia would make tea in the afternoons and sit with me while I went through my father's papers. Isadora offered to help manage social obligations, returning calls and messages that I was too depressed to handle. Evangeline spent time in my father's shop, familiarizing herself with the inventory and learning about the various artifacts. Looking back, I can see that they were studying me, learning my routines and vulnerabilities, identifying the best ways to manipulate and control me. But at the time, I interpreted their attention as genuine family concern. The first significant change came about a month after they moved in. Cordelia sat me down for what she called a necessary discussion about finances. The transformation from daughter to servant didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, insidious, a slow erosion of my autonomy that happened so incrementally I barely noticed until it was too late. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they formed a pattern that trapped me completely. It started with small requests that seemed innocent enough. Cordelia mentioned that she had a terrible headache one evening and asked if I might prepare dinner since I seemed to be feeling a bit better. I wanted to be helpful, to show that I appreciated having family support during this difficult time. So I cooked dinner, and everyone praised the meal, telling me I had a real talent for cooking. The next day, Isadora wondered if I might pick up her dry cleaning since I was planning to go out anyway. She had an important interview, she explained, and really needed that particular outfit. It seemed like such a small favor, and I was going out, so why not? Evangeline casually mentioned that the downstairs bathroom could use a cleaning. She wasn't demanding, just observing, but there was an expectation in her tone that suggested I might take care of it. After all, I was home all day while they were out networking and handling important business matters. Each request seemed reasonable in isolation. I wanted to be helpful, to contribute to the household, to show that I was willing to be part of this new family structure. But the requests multiplied, expanded, evolved from occasional favors into expected duties. Within 2 months, I had somehow become responsible for all the cooking. Cordelia explained that she had never been particularly good in the kitchen, and Isadora and Evangeline had other priorities. Since I seemed to enjoy it and was quite talented, wouldn't it make sense for me to handle meal preparation? She made it sound like a privilege, like I was being given an important role in maintaining family harmony. The cleaning followed a similar pattern. Cordelia had always employed housekeepers in her previous home, but she suggested that having strangers in the house felt inappropriate during our period of mourning. Wouldn't it be better if we handled things ourselves, as a family? And since I was home most of the time anyway, coordinating my father's estate and business, couldn't I also manage the household maintenance? My father's business, which had been my inheritance and my future, was gradually taken over by Cordelia with such smooth efficiency that I barely noticed it happening. She started by offering to help with customer relations, explaining that she had extensive experience in sales and client management. She had connections in the art world that could be valuable, contacts who could help expand the business. At first, she just assisted with particularly important clients or complicated negotiations. But slowly, she began making more significant decisions. She rearranged the shop layout to be more appealing to wealthy collectors. She brought in new inventory that catered to high-end buyers. She established relationships with auction houses and private dealers that my father had never worked with. She promised that we were partners, that all decisions were collaborative, that the profits would be shared equally. She showed me spreadsheets and financial reports that seemed to prove the business was thriving under her management. But somehow, the money that should have been mine never actually materialized. There were always expenses I hadn't anticipated. The business needed to invest in better security systems, more sophisticated inventory management software, upgraded display cases. There were auction fees, consultant charges, transportation costs for moving valuable pieces. Cordelia explained each expense carefully, making it all sound necessary and reasonable. Then there were the debts she claimed my father had accumulated before his death. He had apparently taken out loans to purchase particularly valuable pieces, had made investments that hadn't yet matured, had committed to payments for items that were still in transit. All of these obligations needed to be honored, she explained, or the business's reputation would be destroyed. I had no way to verify any of this. Cordelia controlled all the business accounts and records. The lawyer she consulted confirmed that her marriage gave her legal authority over half of everything. Any attempt to challenge her would require my own legal representation, which I couldn't afford, and would likely result in the business being dissolved entirely. So I said nothing and watched as my inheritance was systematically drained away. The living arrangements changed gradually as well. Initially, Cordelia and her daughters had taken guest rooms on the second floor, respectfully giving me space and privacy. But after about 3 months, Evangeline mentioned that she really needed better lighting for her art studio. The guest room she was using faced north, and the light was all wrong for her painting. My bedroom, on the other hand, had beautiful southern exposure with large windows that provided excellent natural light. Would I mind terribly switching rooms? It would just be temporary, until they could renovate one of the third-floor spaces to create a proper studio for Evangeline's artistic pursuits. I moved to a smaller room on the second floor, telling myself it was temporary, that I was being a good family member by accommodating Evangeline's needs. But the promised renovation never happened, and I never got my room back. A few months later, Isadora needed more closet space for her expanding wardrobe. She had been making connections in local society, being invited to increasingly prestigious events, and she needed appropriate clothing for each occasion. My second-floor room had the largest closet in that section of the house. Would I mind moving to one of the smaller third-floor bedrooms? Just temporarily. Just until they could install better closet systems throughout the house. It was actually a practical decision, Cordelia explained, because I spent so much time in my father's third-floor study anyway. Wouldn't it be more convenient to have my bedroom on the same floor? I moved again, this time to what had once been intended as a maid's quarters. The room was tiny, barely large enough for a bed and a small desk. There was one window that looked out onto the alley behind our house, offering a view of garbage bins and the back wall of the neighboring building. The ceiling sloped at an odd angle, and in winter, the room was freezing despite the house's central heating. This was where I lived now, in a servant's room in my own house, surrounded by the few possessions I had been able to keep, because my belongings had been gradually claimed as well, always with plausible explanations that made saying no seem petty or unreasonable. That designer jacket I never wore anymore was exactly Isadora's size, and she had an important interview. Surely I didn't mind lending it to her. Except lending became permanent possession, and I never saw the jacket again. The pearl necklace my father had given me for my 18th birthday looked absolutely perfect with a dress Evangeline was wearing to a gallery opening. It would just be for one night, and it meant so much to her to have something elegant to wear. But when I asked for it back, she couldn't quite remember where she had put it, and eventually it appeared in her jewelry box as if it had always belonged there. My father's rare book collection was too valuable to leave scattered around my small room, Cordelia decided. The books needed to be properly stored and preserved in the library, where temperature and humidity could be controlled. She was just being responsible, protecting my inheritance. Except I was no longer allowed to access them freely, because they were too fragile and valuable to be handled without proper care. Piece by piece, I was being erased from my own life, dispossessed of everything that had made me who I was. My days developed a brutal routine that ground me down physically and emotionally, hour by hour, until I barely recognized the person I had become. I woke each morning at 5 a.m., not by choice but by necessity. If breakfast wasn't ready by 6:30 precisely, Cordelia's mood would darken the entire house for the rest of the day. I learned quickly that it was easier to lose sleep than to face her cold displeasure. The kitchen became my prison and my sanctuary. I would stumble down the back staircase in the pre-dawn darkness, often still wearing yesterday's clothes because I was too exhausted to bother changing into pajamas at night. The house was silent except for the old building settling, creaking in ways that had once felt comforting but now just emphasized my isolation. Cordelia required her coffee at exactly 6:30, not a minute earlier or later. It had to be served in the Limoges china that had been my grandmother's, a delicate set that was now used daily despite its irreplaceable value. The coffee had to be French roast, ground fresh each morning, brewed to a precise strength and temperature that I had learned to achieve through countless corrections and criticisms. Along with the coffee, I had to prepare a specific selection of pastries. Not store-bought, Cordelia made clear early on, but freshly baked each morning. Croissants on Mondays and Thursdays, pain au chocolat on Tuesdays and Fridays, almond Danish on Wednesdays, and a rotating selection on weekends. Each pastry had to be perfect, golden and flaky, with the right texture and temperature. I would set everything on a tray with a linen napkin that I had pressed the night before, along with a small crystal vase holding a single fresh flower from the garden. The presentation mattered almost as much as the quality of the food itself. Isadora's requirements were different but equally demanding. She had become obsessed with health and wellness, following whatever trendy diet was popular among her social circle at any given moment. This meant that her breakfast order changed frequently and required special ingredients that I had to purchase from expensive organic markets across town. One month, she wanted elaborate smoothie bowls with acai berries, spirulina, and exotic fruits that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for an entire week. The next month, she had switched to raw food, demanding elaborate salads and sprouted grain combinations that required advanced preparation and specific timing. She would text me her order each night before bed, often changing her mind multiple times, and I was expected to have everything ready by 7 a.m. when she came downstairs in her designer workout clothes, already glowing from whatever exercise class she had taken in our converted third-floor ballroom. Evangeline needed her tea prepared with precision that bordered on obsessive. She claimed to be a tea connoisseur, having developed refined tastes during a summer she had spent in England several years earlier. The water had to be heated to specific temperatures depending on the type of tea. 175 degrees Celsius for green tea, 185 degrees Celsius for white tea, 200 degrees Celsius for oolong, boiling for black tea and herbal infusions. Each tea had to be steeped for exactly the right amount of time. 3 minutes and 45 seconds for most black teas, 2 minutes for delicate green teas, 7 minutes for herbal blends. I learned to keep multiple timers running simultaneously, monitoring each cup with the attention of a chemist conducting a crucial experiment. The teacup itself mattered. Different teas required different cups from my family's antique collection, and Evangeline would know immediately if I served her morning Earl Grey in the wrong vessel. She would push it away with a look of pained disappointment, as if I had deliberately tried to ruin her day. After breakfast service, which often took until 8:30 or 9 by the time I had served everyone, cleaned up from preparation, and washed all the dishes by hand because Cordelia insisted that our antique china was too valuable for the dishwasher, I would move on to cleaning the house. Our Victorian mansion had 12 rooms, not counting bathrooms, hallways, and the various storage spaces scattered throughout. Each room required specific attention. The hardwood floors had to be dust mopped daily and washed weekly with a special solution that wouldn't damage the antique wood. The furniture had to be dusted with particular cloths that wouldn't scratch the finishes. The windows, all 47 of them, needed to be cleaned weekly on a rotating schedule. Cordelia had developed a system, a detailed chart that outlined exactly which rooms needed what attention on which days. She would conduct inspections randomly, running her finger along baseboards, checking corners for cobwebs, examining window sills for dust. If she found anything less than perfect, she would point it out with a cold precision that made me feel like a lazy child, rather than a grown woman working herself to exhaustion. The laundry alone was a full-time job. Cordelia, Isadora, and Evangeline each changed clothes multiple times per day. Morning workout wear, breakfast attire, daytime outfits, afternoon social engagement clothes, evening wear, and pajamas. Each category had its own requirements for washing, drying, and storage. Delicate items had to be hand-washed in the basement sink using specific detergents that were gentle enough not to damage expensive fabrics. Designer pieces needed to be laid flat to dry on special mesh racks. Everything required pressing, using an antique iron that I had to heat on the stove because Cordelia insisted modern irons were too harsh for fine fabrics. I spent entire afternoons in that basement laundry room, standing at the sink with my hands raw from hot water and harsh soaps, or bent over the ironing board until my back screamed in protest. The basement was damp and cold in winter, sweltering in summer, and always smelled faintly of mildew no matter how much I cleaned. But the most demanding part of my routine was meal preparation. Cordelia had developed elaborate tastes, inspired by whatever cooking show she was currently watching or restaurant she had recently visited. She expected multi-course meals for both lunch and dinner, with professional-level presentation and restaurant-quality execution. Lunch preparation began at 11 a.m. Cordelia preferred light but sophisticated midday meals, salads with house-made dressings, gourmet sandwiches on artisanal bread that I had to bake myself, soups made from scratch using organic vegetables and homemade stock. Each meal had to be served at precisely 12:30, arranged artistically on our best china, accompanied by appropriate beverages and fresh-baked bread. Dinner was even more elaborate. Cordelia had started hosting regular dinner parties, showing off her new social connections and establishing herself in local high society. These events required days of preparation, menu planning, grocery shopping, advanced cooking, setting the table with our finest linens and crystal and silver, preparing centerpieces, and ensuring every detail was absolutely perfect. On dinner party nights, I would spend entire days cooking complex dishes that required multiple steps and precise timing. Roasted meats that had to be seared, braised, and finished in the oven. Delicate sauces that required constant attention and whisking. Elaborate desserts that demanded technical skill and artistic presentation. During these parties, I existed only as hands that delivered plates and refilled wine glasses. I was not introduced to the guests, not acknowledged as part of the family, not even really seen as a person. Cordelia had trained me to enter and exit the dining room through the service door, to move silently and efficiently, to be present but invisible. I would catch glimpses of the dining room through the kitchen doorway, Cordelia holding court at the head of the table, wearing jewelry that had belonged to my mother. Isadora charming potential suitors with practiced smiles and rehearsed wit. Evangeline discussing art with local gallery owners, positioning herself as a cultured sophisticate. These were the evenings that broke me in ways that physical exhaustion never could. Standing in the kitchen, wearing an apron that was stained from the day's cooking, listening to their laughter and animated conversation, I would feel something inside me crumble. This was my house, my family's home for generations, and I had been reduced to hired help in my own space. The guests would occasionally ask about me. Who had prepared this delicious meal? Where had Cordelia found such a talented chef? The questions always came with an undercurrent of curiosity about the unseen servant who had created what they were enjoying. Cordelia always had an answer ready. She would explain that I was a distant relative who was living with them while getting back on my feet after some unnamed misfortune. Or she would claim I was an au pair from Europe, here to improve my English and learn about American culture. Or sometimes she would simply say I was household staff, changing the subject before anyone could ask follow-up questions. I was never allowed to correct these stories or present my own version of reality. On the rare occasions when a guest would insist on complimenting me directly, Cordelia would summon me to the dining room where I would accept their praise with downcast eyes and minimal words, playing the role of grateful servant that she had assigned me. By the time these dinner parties ended, usually around midnight, I would still have hours of work ahead of me. All the dishes had to be washed by hand because Cordelia insisted our antique china and crystal couldn't be trusted to a dishwasher. The kitchen had to be scrubbed clean, food stored properly, garbage taken out, and everything returned to perfect order for the next morning. I would finally stumble up to my tiny third-floor room around 2 or 3 a.m., so exhausted that I could barely undress before collapsing into bed. Then, just a few hours later, my alarm would sound and the entire cycle would begin again. There were no days off, no breaks from the routine. Even on days when there were no dinner parties scheduled, there were always tasks that needed completion. Cordelia would create lists of projects, deep cleaning closets, reorganizing storage spaces, polishing silver, maintaining the garden, repairing household items that had fallen into disrepair. I was trapped in a cycle of labor that was designed to keep me too busy, too tired, and too isolated to resist or escape. The loneliness was crushing in ways I struggle to articulate even now. I had lost touch with my friends during my father's illness, and Cordelia made sure I had no time or opportunity to rebuild those connections. Any attempt to leave the house was met with a new crisis that required my immediate attention, a new task that only I could complete, a new emergency that would be catastrophic if I wasn't there to handle it. I was isolated, exhausted, and increasingly desperate. But I had one escape, one sanctuary that even Cordelia couldn't touch: my father's study. The study was a small room tucked away on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that most people overlooked. It was deliberately easy to miss, with a door that looked like it might lead to a linen closet or storage space rather than a room of significance. My father had designed it that way, I would later understand, creating a private space where he could keep his most important work hidden from casual observation. Cordelia had claimed most of my father's valuable artifacts for sale through the business, methodically going through the house and identifying pieces that would appeal to wealthy collectors. She had taken the obviously valuable items: antique furniture, rare paintings, precious jewelry, first-edition books that were clearly worth thousands of dollars. But she had missed this room, perhaps because it appeared to contain only papers and ordinary books with no obvious resale value. Or perhaps my father had protected it somehow, using his knowledge and connections to ensure that this space would remain undiscovered until I was ready to find it. I started spending my late nights in that study after everyone else had gone to bed, usually arriving around 2 or 3 in the morning after finishing my endless tasks. I would climb the creaking stairs to the 3rd floor, moving as quietly as possible to avoid alerting anyone to my movements, and slip into that room like a thief entering a forbidden space. The study was exactly as my father had left it. His reading lamp still sat on the desk, angled just the way he liked it for late-night work. His favorite pen lay next to a half-finished page of notes, as if he had just stepped away for a moment and would return at any second. The air still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he had occasionally indulged in, mixed with old paper and leather bindings. Being in that room felt like being close to my father again. I could almost hear his voice explaining something fascinating, feel his presence in the careful organization of his materials, sense his personality in the books he had chosen to keep in this private space. The room wasn't large, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, but every surface was covered with materials. Bookshelves lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, packed with volumes in multiple languages. The desk was buried under papers, journals, and loose photographs. Filing cabinets in the corner contained carefully organized documents and research notes. At first, I just sat in his chair and felt the comfort of being surrounded by his things. But gradually, as weeks passed and my isolation deepened, I began to actually examine what he had collected. The books were extraordinary, not just in terms of their rarity or value, though many were certainly rare and valuable, but in terms of their subject matter. My father had assembled what I slowly realized was probably the most comprehensive private library on vampire studies in existence. There were ancient texts in languages I could barely identify, let alone read, medieval manuscripts describing vampire society's structure and laws, Victorian-era journals documenting encounters between humans and vampires during that period of rapid industrialization, modern academic analyses treating vampire culture as seriously as any anthropologist would approach human societies. Some volumes appeared to be written by vampires themselves, first-hand accounts of their experiences and perspectives. Others were clearly human writings, attempts to understand and document a hidden world that most people believed was pure fiction. I would sit at my father's desk with these books, reading by lamplight while the house slept around me, slowly beginning to piece together an understanding of something that fundamentally challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. The books explained that vampires weren't the monsters of popular fiction. They didn't burst into flame in sunlight, though most found it uncomfortable and preferred nocturnal activities. They didn't need to kill to feed, having developed ethical systems around consensual blood donation and alternatives. They weren't undead corpses, but rather a different evolutionary path, beings who had developed differently from baseline humanity in ways that granted extended lifespans and enhanced abilities. But what made these books truly extraordinary was how they documented vampire society's interaction with human civilization throughout history. Vampires hadn't lived in isolation from humanity. They had walked among humans for millennia, influencing historical events, funding artistic movements, preserving knowledge through dark ages, and generally serving as hidden participants in human cultural evolution. Many great artists, scientists, and thinkers had been vampires, using their extended lifespans to develop expertise that would have been impossible in a normal human lifetime. Some had revealed themselves to trusted human allies. Others had maintained absolute secrecy, leaving behind legacies that were attributed to humans but had actually been vampire creations. I found genealogies documenting vampire family lines stretching back thousands of years. I discovered maps showing vampire communities in cities around the world. I read detailed descriptions of vampire social customs, laws, and traditions that were as complex and sophisticated as any human culture. But the most shocking discoveries were the photographs. My father had collected hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all carefully organized in albums and boxes. They showed social events, formal gatherings, intimate dinners, casual meetings. The photographs spanned well over a century, from early daguerreotypes to modern digital prints. And in photograph after photograph, the same people appeared, utterly unchanged by the passage of time. I would see a formal portrait from 1890 showing a group of elegantly dressed individuals at what appeared to be a society ball. Then, 50 years later, I would find a photograph from 1940 showing the exact same individuals, not aged a day, attending another formal event. Then again in photographs from the 1970s, the 1990s, the early 2000s. The people in these photographs didn't just look similar. They were identical, down to distinctive features, unique physical characteristics, and even certain pieces of jewelry that appeared across decades. But what truly shocked me was discovering my father in these photographs. I found him first in an image from 1923, standing at the edge of a group at what the caption identified as a gathering of the Nightshade Society in London. He looked exactly as I remembered him from my childhood, not younger or different in any way. Then I found him in photographs from the 1950s, the 1970s, the 1980s. In every single image, Spanning nearly 100 years, my father looked precisely the same. No aging, no changes, nothing that would indicate the passage of time. My father hadn't been human. He had been a vampire, living among humans for generations, maintaining a cover as an ordinary antiques dealer while actually serving some other purpose in vampire society, which meant that I wasn't entirely human either. This realization didn't come all at once. It built gradually as I pieced together evidence from multiple sources, connecting fragments of information into a coherent, impossible truth. I found my father's personal journals, decades worth of entries written in his familiar handwriting. They detailed his actual life, not the edited version he had presented to me growing up, but the truth of his existence as a vampire scholar working to preserve knowledge and build bridges between human and vampire communities. He wrote about meeting my mother, a human woman he had fallen deeply in love with despite the social complications and biological uncertainties their relationship created. He described the controversy their marriage had caused in vampire society, the debates about whether such a union could or should produce children. Then he wrote about my birth and the immediate questions it raised. I had been born appearing fully human, with none of the obvious markers of vampire heritage. But as I grew, certain unusual characteristics had emerged that suggested my vampire genetics might be dormant rather than absent. I had always been sensitive to sunlight, requiring sunscreen even on cloudy days and avoiding direct sun exposure whenever possible. I had attributed this to fair skin, never considering it might be a vampiric trait. My hearing had always been exceptionally acute, allowing me to detect sounds that others missed. I had thought this was just good genetics, not a supernatural ability. I had occasional episodes of what I had called intuition, moments when I seemed to know things about people that I had no logical reason to know. I could sense when someone was lying, feel emotional states even when they were carefully hidden, and occasionally predict what someone was about to say before they spoke. I had dismissed these experiences as lucky guesses or good observational skills. But my father's journals described all of these things as potential indicators of dormant vampire heritage. I was a half-vampire, he wrote, with genetics that might remain latent indefinitely or might activate under specific circumstances. He had been waiting, watching, preparing for the possibility that I would develop full vampire abilities. The homeschooling, the unusual education, the isolation from normal society, all of it had been designed to protect me and prepare me for a transformation he thought might eventually occur. But then he had died before he could complete my preparation, leaving me with fragmentary knowledge and no understanding of what was happening to me. Because things were happening, changes I had been ignoring or explaining away were becoming increasingly obvious. My senses were sharpening beyond normal human ranges. I could hear conversations from other rooms, distinguish individual heartbeats in a crowd, detect scents that should have been imperceptible. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct, textures more nuanced. My physical abilities were enhancing as well. I healed faster than I should from the inevitable cuts and burns that came with cooking and housework. I could lift heavy objects that should have strained my muscles. I could work for hours without tiring as much as I logically should. And I had developed an uncomfortable awareness of blood that I couldn't ignore. Not a hunger or craving, nothing predatory or monstrous, but a constant awareness of the life force flowing through living beings around me. I could sense heartbeats, feel the rhythm of circulation, even detect subtle changes in blood pressure that indicated emotional states. I was transforming into something other, and I had absolutely no guidance for how to navigate this change. The realization didn't come all at once. It built gradually as I pieced together fragments of evidence, reading my father's journals and research notes, examining photographs and documents that shouldn't have existed. I found medical records showing that I had unusual reactions to certain tests, abnormal results that doctors had dismissed as laboratory errors or rare genetic variations. I found journal entries from my father describing his concerns about my development, his uncertainty about which aspects of my heritage would manifest and when. Most telling of all, I found letters from other vampires, colleagues who had known my father, and who had been watching my development with interest. They wrote about me as a curiosity, a hybrid whose existence raised fascinating questions about the compatibility of vampire and human genetics. They also wrote about the dangers I would face if my true nature became known to either the human or vampire communities without proper protection and education. My father had been preparing to tell me everything, The papers in his study included detailed plans for my introduction to vampire society, lists of people who would support and guide me, and comprehensive explanations of the abilities I might develop. He had been waiting for the right moment, probably planning to reveal everything after I finished college and had established some independence. But death had come too quickly, and I was left with knowledge but no guidance, power but no training, and a heritage I barely understood. That's when the dreams started to make sense. For months, I had been having vivid dreams about elegant ballrooms, formal gardens, and gatherings of extraordinarily beautiful people. In these dreams, I felt confident, powerful, like I belonged among them. A tall figure would watch me from across the room, his face always just slightly obscured, but his presence felt magnetic, compelling. I had dismissed these dreams as wish fulfillment, my subconscious creating a fantasy life to escape from my miserable waking existence. But now I understood they were something more. Inherited memories from my vampire lineage, glimpses of a world I was meant to inhabit but had been kept from. The figure in my dreams was real. He was waiting for me. And somehow, I knew that meeting him would change everything. I started noticing changes in myself that I had previously ignored or explained away. I had always been unusually sensitive to sunlight, but I had attributed this to fair skin and light sensitivity. Now I realized that direct sunlight made me physically uncomfortable in ways that went beyond simple sun sensitivity. My hearing had always been acute, but lately it had become almost supernatural. I could hear conversations from other rooms, distinguish individual voices in crowded spaces, and even catch the subtle changes in heartbeat that indicated when someone was lying. My sense of smell had become remarkably refined. I could identify people by their scent, detect emotional states through subtle chemical changes, and even sense things about people's health that I shouldn't have been able to know. Most disturbing of all, I had developed an uncomfortable awareness of blood, not in a monstrous or predatory way, but as a constant presence in my consciousness. I could hear heartbeats, sensed the flow of blood through veins, and felt an almost hypnotic pull toward the life force that sustained human existence. I was becoming something other, and I had no one to guide me through the transformation. Then, 3 months after I discovered my father's research, Cordelia made an announcement that changed everything. She had received an invitation to an engagement party. Not just any engagement party, but a celebration hosted by the Blackthorne family, one of the oldest and wealthiest families in our city. Marcus Blackthorne, heir to their considerable fortune and influence, had become engaged to Isadora. The courtship had been brief but intense. Marcus had approached Isadora at a charity function 2 months earlier, and their relationship had progressed with remarkable speed. Cordelia was beside herself with excitement, seeing this as the social triumph she had been orchestrating since moving into our house. I learned all of this secondhand, of course. No one thought to tell me directly. I overheard conversations, caught fragments of excited planning, and gradually pieced together that my stepsister was about to marry into the kind of wealth and influence that most people only dreamed about. What my stepfamily didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I recognized the name Marcus Blackthorne immediately. His family appeared throughout my father's research. The Blackthornes were vampire aristocracy, one of the oldest and most influential families in the hidden world my father had documented. They owned legitimate businesses that generated enormous wealth while also serving as cover for their true nature and activities. Marcus Blackthorne himself appeared in photographs dating back over 100 years, unchanged and unchanging. He was the figure from my dreams, the presence that had been watching me with interest and something that felt like recognition. And now he was supposedly engaged to my stepsister, who had absolutely no idea what she was getting herself into. Part of me wanted to warn Isadora. Despite everything she had done to me, the thought of her being deceived into marriage with a vampire seemed fundamentally wrong. But I knew that any attempt to explain would be dismissed as jealousy, delusion, or desperate attention-seeking. Worse, it might reveal that I knew about the vampire world, which could be dangerous for reasons I didn't fully understand. So I kept silent and watched as preparations for the engagement party consumed our household. Cordelia hired an army of professionals to ensure her daughters made perfect impressions. Personal stylists, makeup artists, etiquette instructors, and even a photographer to document their transformation into society darlings. Money that should have been used to maintain my father's business or pay household expenses was instead poured into creating the perfect public image. Isadora spent weeks selecting the ideal dress, having it altered and fitted until it achieved absolute perfection. Evangeline received her own elaborate preparations, determined to attract her own wealthy suitor at the party. They discussed fashion, jewelry, conversation strategies, and social tactics with the seriousness of generals planning a military campaign. Through all of this, my role remained the same: servant, caretaker, invisible support staff. I was expected to facilitate their preparations while remaining entirely in the background, present but unacknowledged, until Cordelia received a second communication from the Blackthorn family that changed everything. The message was simple but unprecedented. The Blackthorns requested that the entire family attend the engagement party, including me specifically by name. Cordelia's reaction was complex. On one hand, having the complete family present would demonstrate respectability and substance. On the other hand, she was terrified that I might somehow embarrass them or reveal our family's actual dynamics to these influential people. The solution was to transform me temporarily into someone presentable. The next 2 weeks were surreal. Cordelia hired the same professionals who had prepared Isadora and Evangeline, and I found myself being subjected to intensive styling, wardrobe selection, and etiquette coaching. They worked on me like sculptors with raw material, trying to create an acceptable facade that would pass inspection at an elite social event. The transformation process was both humiliating and oddly thrilling. For 2 weeks, I became a project, a makeover case that Cordelia's team of professionals attacked with military precision. The personal shopper, a severe woman named Margot, who clearly worked with extremely wealthy clients, took one look at my current wardrobe and declared everything unsuitable. She measured every part of my body with clinical precision, made notes in a leather-bound planner, and promised to return with appropriate options within 48 hours. When she came back 3 days later, she brought an entire rack of evening gowns, each more beautiful and expensive than the last. There were gowns in midnight blue, emerald green, silver that sparkled like starlight, and rich jewel tones that seemed to glow with their own inner light. But it was the burgundy silk that made everyone stop and stare when I tried it on. The color was absolutely perfect against my pale skin, neither washing me out nor overwhelming my natural coloring. The cut was flattering in ways that made me look elegant and sophisticated, rather than trying too hard or appearing costume-like. The fabric moved beautifully, flowing like liquid when I walked, catching light in ways that created subtle highlights and shadows. Margot nodded with satisfaction, explaining that the dress had been custom-made by a designer who specialized in events for what she delicately termed exclusive clientele. The fabric was specially treated to move beautifully under various lighting conditions, and the cut was designed to emphasize my particular body type in ways that would appeal to very specific aesthetic sensibilities. I didn't ask how she knew about vampire society or why she was helping dress someone for a vampire event. I was beginning to understand that many humans in service industries catering to the very wealthy were actually serving vampire clientele, knowingly or unknowingly maintaining their secrets while benefiting financially from their patronage. The stylist, a young man named Julian with impeccable taste and endless patience, spent hours working on my appearance. He was gentle and encouraging, treating me like an actual person rather than a problem to be solved. He taught me techniques for makeup application that would enhance my natural features without looking overdone or artificial. He showed me how to style my hair in ways that were elegant but not overly complicated, looks I could potentially recreate myself if needed. But more than just technical instruction, Julian gave me advice that suggested he understood far more than he was saying. He told me to trust my instincts about people, to pay attention to who watched me and how they did it, to remember that appearing confident was often more important than actually feeling confident. He explained that first impressions in certain social circles were crucial and lasting, that people would make judgments about me in the first 30 seconds that would be almost impossible to change later. He taught me how to carry myself with dignity even when feeling terrified, how to smile in ways that appeared warm without being overly familiar, how to make eye contact that conveyed confidence without seeming aggressive or challenging. The etiquette coach, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who had apparently trained society ladies for 5 decades, was refreshingly straightforward. Unlike the others who danced around the subject, She explained vampire social customs directly, making it absolutely clear that she knew exactly what kind of event I would be attending and what kind of people I would be meeting. Mrs. Pemberton had worked with Vampire Society for her entire adult life, she told me. She had trained countless young women who were entering that world for various reasons, and she understood both the opportunities and the dangers that came with such exposure. She taught me how to greet vampire aristocracy with appropriate respect without being obsequious. She explained what topics were safe for conversation and which were potentially dangerous, what questions I could ask, and which ones would be considered intrusive or inappropriate. She showed me how to navigate complex social hierarchies without accidentally offending anyone important. Most importantly, she taught me how to recognize genuine interest versus manipulative attention, how to protect myself in conversations that might have hidden purposes, and how to extract myself gracefully from uncomfortable situations without causing offense or appearing rude. She explained that as someone with mixed heritage, I would occupy an unusual position in vampire society. I would attract curiosity, certainly, but also potential hostility from those who considered mixed heritage individuals problematic or inappropriate. She taught me how to handle both with dignity and intelligence. The coaching was intensive and exhausting, but I absorbed every lesson with desperate attention. This might be my only chance to enter vampire society, and I couldn't afford to make mistakes that would close doors before I even knew they were open. Cordelia watched my transformation with deeply mixed emotions. On one hand, she was pleased that I would present well and reflect favorably on the family. A well-groomed, properly behaved stepdaughter attending the engagement party would enhance the family's image of respectability and substance. On the other hand, I could see her calculating the potential implications of me making genuine connections in vampire society. If I actually succeeded in this environment, if I attracted positive attention or established relationships with influential vampires, that might threaten her control over me and my father's estate. She had built her power on my isolation and dependence. My success could undermine everything she had constructed. Isadora was far less conflicted in her negativity. She made it abundantly clear that she considered my inclusion an unnecessary complication and a potential embarrassment. She went out of her way to establish hierarchies and boundaries, reminding me constantly that I was attending as family obligation rather than genuine guest. She told me exactly where to stand during introductions, positioned slightly behind and to the side so I would be visible but not prominent. She warned me not to speak unless directly addressed, and even then to keep my responses brief and unremarkable. She emphasized repeatedly that any social mistakes I made would reflect directly on her engagement and future marriage. The anxiety she projected was palpable and somewhat surprising. It suggested that perhaps she suspected more about Marcus and his world than she was willing to admit, that some instinct was warning her she was entering dangerous territory even if she couldn't consciously acknowledge it. Evangeline was more diplomatic but equally concerned. She worried that I might accidentally reveal our actual family dynamics, that my obvious exhaustion or social awkwardness might hint at the truth of my circumstances. She coached me extensively on how to deflect personal questions, how to keep conversations superficial and safe, how to present a facade of normalcy that hid the dysfunction beneath. Through all of this preparation and coaching, I said very little. I submitted to their instructions, absorbed their lessons, and kept my own counsel about what I knew and what I suspected. Let them think I was a nervous outsider being temporarily elevated for appearance's sake. Let them believe I was grateful for their guidance and terrified of embarrassing them. The truth was so much more complicated than they could imagine. I wasn't preparing to attend a party as an awkward family obligation. I was preparing to step into my birthright, to meet the world my father had documented, to potentially discover who and what I truly was. The night before the party, I barely slept. I lay in my tiny third-floor room, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about everything that might happen the next day. This was my chance to step into the world my father had documented, to meet the vampire family that had known him, to potentially discover the truth about my own nature and abilities. But it was also dangerous. I would be walking into a completely unknown situation with limited knowledge and no real support. If I made mistakes, if I revealed too much about what I knew, if I somehow offended important vampires, the consequences could be severe in ways I couldn't predict. I thought about my father, imagining what advice he would give if he were still alive. He had spent his existence building bridges between communities, navigating complex social and political situations, maintaining relationships that spanned centuries. He had operated in dangerous territory for longer than I could comprehend, balancing between worlds and identities with grace and intelligence. He had prepared me as best he could with the resources he left behind, but ultimately I would have to trust my instincts and hope they were enough to carry me through whatever challenges awaited. As dawn approached and I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I had one more dream. But this one felt qualitatively different from all the others, more immediate and real, as if the barrier between sleeping and waking was dissolving. I was standing in the moonlit garden, wearing the burgundy dress, and the watching figure was finally visible. He was tall and elegant, with dark hair and eyes that held centuries of knowledge and experience. He looked at me with recognition, and something that might have been relief, as if he had been waiting a very long time for this specific moment. He reached out his hand toward me, an invitation and a promise. His expression was gentle but serious, suggesting that he understood the significance of what he was offering. This wasn't just a gesture of welcome, it was an offer to step into a completely different life, to claim an identity that had been waiting for me. And in the dream, I took his hand without hesitation, stepping forward into a future I couldn't see but desperately wanted to claim. When our hands touched, I felt something surge through me, a recognition that went beyond mere attraction or curiosity. This was connection on a fundamental level, as if our very essences recognized each other. When I woke that morning, my hand was still extended, reaching for something that wasn't there in physical reality. But I could still feel the warmth where his hand had touched mine, and I knew with absolute certainty that the dream was showing me what was about to become real. Today was the day everything would change. I submitted to all of it with a mixture of terror and anticipation. This was my chance to enter the world my father had written about, to meet the vampire family that might hold the key to my own transformation. But I would be walking into a completely unknown situation with no preparation and no understanding of vampire social customs. The stylist selected a gown in deep burgundy silk that fit as if it had been custom-made for my body. The color was striking against my pale skin, and the cut was elegant without being ostentatious. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. But the most dramatic changes were happening inside me, beyond what any stylist could create. As the evening of the party approached, I felt something awakening in my blood. My senses sharpened even further, my reflexes became faster, and I developed an almost preternatural awareness of my surroundings. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct, and I could sense emotional currents in people around me with disturbing clarity. The dormant vampire heritage my father had written about was finally stirring to life, triggered perhaps by proximity to my own kind, or by the intense emotional pressure of my circumstances. The night of the engagement party arrived with unseasonable warmth and a full moon that seemed to illuminate the entire city. Our car pulled up to the Blackthorn estate just after sunset, and I felt my breath catch at the sight of it. The mansion was enormous, a Gothic masterpiece that combined Victorian elegance with something ancient and otherworldly. Gardens surrounded the main house, carefully designed landscapes that somehow managed to feel wild and cultivated simultaneously. Lights glowed from dozens of windows, and music drifted across the grounds, sophisticated and hypnotic. We entered through massive wooden doors that looked like they had witnessed centuries of history. The interior was breathtaking: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, artwork that belonged in museums, and an atmosphere of refined power that was almost tangible. But what struck me most forcefully wasn't the luxury or the beauty. It was the guests. Every person in that ballroom was extraordinarily beautiful, moving with a grace that seemed almost superhuman. Their skin had a luminous quality that no amount of expensive skincare could replicate. Their eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience, wisdom, and carefully controlled power. And when they smiled, I caught glimpses of teeth that were just slightly too sharp to be entirely human. I was surrounded by vampires, hundreds of them, all gathered to celebrate an engagement that I suspected was far more complicated than it appeared. For the first time in my life, despite being among the creatures that haunted human nightmares, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Cordelia immediately began networking, introducing Isadora to various important guests and showcasing her accomplishments with the enthusiasm of a salesperson closing a major deal. Evangeline attached herself to a group of young people near the refreshment table, clearly determined to make the most of this unexpected social opportunity. But I found myself drawn toward the garden, following an instinct I didn't fully understand. The night air was perfumed with night-blooming jasmine and something else, something indefinable that called to parts of me I was only beginning to acknowledge. I had barely stepped onto the terrace when I felt his presence behind me. I turned, and there he was, Marcus Blackthorne, the figure from my dreams, the vampire who was supposedly engaged to my stepsister. Up close, he was even more striking than I had imagined. Tall, with dark hair and eyes that held centuries of knowledge and something that looked remarkably like kindness. He said he had been waiting for me, that he had known I would find my way to this place eventually. His voice was cultured, precise, with an accent that suggested multiple centuries of linguistic evolution. I should have been terrified. I should have run back to the safety of the crowded ballroom. Instead, I felt something inside me respond to his presence, recognition on a level deeper than consciousness or rational thought. He told me he had known my father well, that Jonathan Ashwood had been one of his closest friends for over a century. They had worked together to document vampire history, build bridges between human and vampire communities, and protect individuals like me who existed between both worlds. Marcus explained that he had been watching my development from a distance, concerned about my circumstances but unable to intervene directly without risking exposure of the vampire world. When my father died, leaving me vulnerable and alone, Marcus had felt obligated to honor his friend's memory by ensuring my safety. The engagement to Isadora had been a fabrication, a carefully constructed plan to create an opportunity to meet me without arousing suspicion. He had never intended to actually marry my stepsister, who had absolutely no idea about his true nature or the real purpose of their relationship. I should have been outraged by this manipulation. Instead, I felt something like relief flooding through me. This wasn't about Isadora at all. This was about me, about my heritage, about finally connecting with someone who understood what I was becoming. Marcus saw my shock and quickly explained that he had never intended to deceive anyone maliciously. He genuinely cared about my well-being and had been concerned about what he had observed of my circumstances. From his perspective, I was essentially being held prisoner in my own home, with no opportunity to explore my true nature or make genuine choices about my future. He assured me that the engagement to Isadora would be dissolved quietly after tonight. She would be disappointed, but she would also be compensated financially in ways that would secure her future and satisfy Cordelia's ambitions. His family had no intention of forcing anyone into unwanted relationships, but he hoped that I might consider spending time with him, learning about vampire society and culture, exploring the heritage that my father had kept hidden for so long. He could offer me education, protection, and most importantly, the freedom to choose my own path. We talked for hours in that garden, standing among night-blooming flowers while the party continued inside. The conversation flowed naturally, as if we had known each other far longer than these few minutes, as if we were continuing a dialogue that had begun in my dreams and was only now becoming fully real. Marcus told me about my father's work, about the contributions Jonathan Ashwood had made to both human and vampire knowledge over his centuries of existence. My father hadn't just collected artifacts and documented history. He had served as a mediator between species, helping to prevent conflicts and build understanding during crucial historical moments. He had worked behind the scenes during various human revolutions and wars, ensuring that vampire communities weren't exposed during times of social upheaval. He had helped establish protocols for how vampires and humans could coexist in increasingly modern and interconnected societies. He had been instrumental in creating the systems that allowed vampires to maintain their secrecy while still participating meaningfully in human cultural evolution. Marcus shared stories about their friendship that made my father come alive in ways I had never known. He told me about adventures they had undertaken together, tracking down rare artifacts in dangerous locations, negotiating with hostile vampire factions who wanted to maintain complete separation from humanity, and establishing safe spaces where mixed heritage individuals could develop their abilities without fear. The profound respect and affection in Marcus's voice when he spoke about my father was unmistakable. This wasn't just professional regard or superficial friendship. They had been true companions, brothers in all but blood, partners in a mission that spanned longer than most human civilizations. He explained vampire society's structure in detail, helping me understand the complex hierarchies and social dynamics that governed their world. There were the old families like the Blackthorns, vampires whose lineages stretched back thousands of years and who held positions of significant influence and authority. There were younger vampires, those who had been turned more recently and were still learning to navigate their new existence. There were also various factions and philosophical groups within vampire society. Some believed in complete separation from humanity, maintaining their own communities and avoiding unnecessary contact. Others, like my father and Marcus, believed in cautious integration, finding ways to coexist and even collaborate with humans while protecting the secrets that kept vampires safe. Marcus was honest about the challenges I would face as someone with mixed heritage. I occupied an unusual position, neither fully human nor fully vampire, existing in a space between worlds that most people from either community found difficult to understand or accept. Some vampires would view me with suspicion or hostility, seeing mixed heritage individuals as problematic complications that blurred important boundaries. They might question my loyalty, wondering whether I would prioritize my vampire heritage or my human connections. They might worry that I represented a threat to the secrecy that protected vampire society. But there were also vampires who would be fascinated by me, intrigued by what my existence represented. Mixed heritage individuals had unique perspectives and abilities that could benefit both communities. We could serve as bridges, translators of culture and experience, mediators who understood both worlds from the inside. As we talked, I felt myself relaxing in ways I hadn't in months, maybe years. Marcus listened to me with genuine attention, asking questions that showed he cared about my thoughts and experiences rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. He validated my feelings about my circumstances with Cordelia without trying to fix everything or tell me what I should do. He acknowledged that my situation was genuinely difficult and that I had survived something that would have destroyed many people. He recognized my strength without dismissing my pain, my intelligence without minimizing the challenges I faced. For the first time since my father's death, I felt truly seen and valued as a complete person. I told him about the loneliness, the isolation, the systematic erosion of my identity that had occurred over the past year. I described the daily routine that had ground me down, the endless labor that left me too exhausted to resist, the careful manipulations that had trapped me in my own home. I shared my discoveries in my father's study, the gradual realization of what I was and what I was becoming. I described the dreams that had shown me this world, the inherited memories that had prepared me for this moment without me understanding what they meant. Marcus listened to everything with an intensity that made me feel like my words mattered, like my experiences were important and worthy of his full attention. He didn't interrupt or offer premature solutions. He just listened, and that simple act of being heard felt like a gift more precious than I could express. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, as if processing everything I had shared and considering his response carefully. Then he told me something that changed how I understood my entire life up to that point. My father hadn't accidentally met my mother. Their relationship hadn't been a random chance encounter. It had been carefully planned by a small group of vampires, including Marcus, who believed that the future of vampire society depended on finding ways to integrate more fully with humanity. They had theorized that children from vampire-human pairings might possess unique abilities that could help bridge the gap between species. These children could potentially move freely in both worlds, understand both perspectives, and serve as mediators in ways that would be impossible for pure-blooded vampires or ordinary humans. My existence had been an experiment, though Marcus was quick to emphasize that my father's love for my mother and for me had been absolutely genuine. The intention behind bringing them together might have been strategic, but the emotions that developed were completely real. I should have been angry about this revelation, about learning that my very existence had been orchestrated by vampires pursuing a larger agenda. But instead, I felt something like relief. My life finally made sense. The unusual education my father had given me, the isolation from normal society, the careful preparation for a transformation I hadn't understood, all of it had been intentional, designed to prepare me for exactly this moment. Marcus explained that my father had been planning to reveal everything to me after I graduated from college and had established some measure of independence. He wanted me to have a normal human experience during my formative years before introducing me to the complexities of vampire society. But his death had come too quickly, before he could complete my education and introduction. Marcus and the other vampires who had known my father felt obligated to honor his wishes by ensuring I eventually found my way to this world, but they had to wait for the right moment and circumstances. The engagement to Isadora had provided that opportunity. It created a legitimate reason for me to attend a Vampire Society event, to enter this world without arousing suspicion from Cordelia or anyone else who might try to prevent my development. As Marcus explained all of this, I realized that I had been watched and protected far more than I had known. My father's death hadn't left me completely alone. There had been guardians in the shadows, vampires who had monitored my circumstances and waited for the right moment to intervene. The mysterious attendees at my father's funeral made sense now. They had been paying respects to their friend and colleague while also assessing me, evaluating whether I was ready to begin learning about my heritage. The key that one of them had given me, which I still had hidden in my room, was probably more significant than I had realized. Marcus confirmed that it opened a safety deposit box my father had maintained, containing resources and information meant specifically for me. As the conversation continued and the night deepened, I became aware that hours had passed. We had been talking for so long that the party inside must be winding down. At some point, I should probably return to check on Cordelia and my stepsisters, though the thought of leaving this conversation felt almost painful. Marcus seemed to sense my reluctance. He suggested that before I returned to the party, he should show me something that might help me understand what my future could hold if I chose to embrace my vampire heritage. But he was also encouraging about the possibilities. Mixed heritage individuals brought unique perspectives and abilities, serving as bridges between communities that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for millennia. I wouldn't be the first to walk this path, and I wouldn't be alone. As we talked, I felt myself changing in ways that went far beyond emotional awakening. My senses continued to sharpen, my awareness of the people around me deepened, and I began to understand instinctively things about vampire social dynamics that no one had taught me. Marcus offered to show me more of the estate, and I followed him without hesitation. He led me through rooms filled with art and artifacts spanning centuries, libraries containing knowledge that most historians could only dream of accessing, and finally to a private study where he kept his most precious possessions. On the walls of that study were portraits of vampire families throughout history, including several featuring my father from different time periods. Seeing my father's face in those paintings, unchanged across decades, made everything finally feel concrete and undeniable. Marcus showed me documents detailing my family history, explaining how my father had met my mother and the controversy their relationship had caused in vampire society. He told me about the debates that had surrounded my birth, the questions about what kind of child would result from such an unprecedented union. But he also showed me records of other mixed heritage vampires throughout history, individuals who had used their unique nature to bridge gaps between species, advance knowledge in multiple fields, and create opportunities for understanding that would have been impossible otherwise. I wouldn't be the first half-vampire, and I wouldn't be alone in navigating the complexities of my dual nature. As the evening progressed and our conversation deepened, I realized that I had been away from Cordelia and her daughters for several hours. They would undoubtedly be looking for me, probably worried that I had somehow embarrassed the family or committed some crucial social violation. But when we returned to the ballroom, I found that Isadora and Evangeline were thoroughly occupied with their own social successes. Several young vampire men had been competing for their attention throughout the evening, and both sisters were glowing with the excitement of being genuinely desired and pursued. Cordelia, meanwhile, had been networking furiously, establishing connections with influential vampire families who believed she was a respectable widow with eligible daughters. Her eyes lit up with calculation when she saw me returning with Marcus, immediately understanding that I had somehow captured the attention of the most eligible vampire in the room. For the first time since my father's death, Cordelia looked at me with something approaching pride. I had succeeded in representing the family well, and my connection with Marcus reflected favorably on all of them. Her mind was already spinning with possibilities, planning ways to leverage this development for maximum social advantage. but Marcus surprised everyone when he made his announcement. He called for the attention of all the guests, his voice carrying effortlessly across the crowded ballroom. Then he formally declared that while he had greatly enjoyed getting to know Isadora, he had realized that they were not suited for marriage. He spoke eloquently about the importance of genuine compatibility and mutual affection in creating lasting relationships, emphasizing that arranged marriages based on social advantage alone rarely resulted in happiness for anyone involved. The engagement was dissolved with such grace and diplomacy that Isadora actually seemed relieved rather than devastated. Several of the young vampire men who had been competing for her attention immediately stepped forward to comfort her, and I could see her calculating which of them might offer even better prospects than Marcus had. But then Marcus did something that stopped all conversation in the ballroom. He turned to me, and in front of all the assembled guests, formally requested permission to court me. The silence that followed was electric with shock and speculation. Everyone in that room understood the social implications of what had just happened. Marcus Blackthorn, heir to one of the most powerful vampire families in existence, had rejected a conventionally appropriate match in favor of pursuing someone who had arrived as essentially a family servant. Cordelia looked like she might faint from the combination of shock and triumph. In the space of a single evening, I had gone from family embarrassment to the most advantageous matrimonial prospect any of them had ever encountered. But I barely noticed their reactions because I was focused entirely on Marcus. He was offering me everything I had never dared to dream of: education about my heritage, protection from those who might exploit my vulnerability, introduction to a world that was literally in my blood, and the possibility of a relationship based on genuine understanding and mutual respect. I accepted his proposal to court, and in that moment, my entire life changed direction. The next 6 months were the most transformative of my existence. Marcus introduced me to vampire society gradually, carefully, ensuring that I never felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was learning. He assigned me tutors who taught me vampire history, social customs, and the practical skills I would need to navigate this hidden world. I learned that vampires weren't the predatory monsters of human fiction. Most were sophisticated beings who valued art, knowledge, and cultural advancement. They had developed elaborate systems for coexisting with humanity without revealing their true nature, contributing to human society through business, philanthropy, and cultural patronage while maintaining their secrecy. The feeding process, which I had imagined as something monstrous, was actually carefully regulated and consensual. Modern vampires used a combination of willing human donors who understood exactly what they were participating in, specialized blood banks that served the vampire community, and in some cases, synthetic alternatives that were being developed through vampire-funded research. My mixed heritage meant that I would never develop the same needs or abilities as a full vampire, but I was already experiencing significant changes. My senses continued to sharpen, my physical capabilities enhanced, and I developed an ability to sense emotional states and intentions that made me remarkably perceptive about people's true motivations. Most importantly, I met other individuals like me, people with mixed heritage who had learned to embrace their unique nature rather than seeing it as a limitation. They were artists, scientists, diplomats, scholars, using their distinctive perspectives to bridge cultural gaps and advance understanding between species. But the most important part of my education was learning to control and develop my emerging vampire abilities under Marcus's patient guidance. He taught me to enhance my senses without becoming overwhelmed by sensory overload. He showed me how to move with the fluid grace that was characteristic of vampire physicality. He helped me access the inherited memories that were my birthright, glimpses of vampire history and culture that were literally encoded in my genetics. As my abilities developed, so did my relationship with Marcus. What had begun as attraction and mutual interest deepened into genuine love based on shared values, compatible temperaments, and profound respect for each other's individuality. He never pressured me to make decisions about my future, never suggested that loving him required abandoning my human connections entirely. Instead, he encouraged me to explore all aspects of my identity and to create my own path that honored both sides of my heritage. Meanwhile, my relationship with Cordelia and her daughters continued to evolve in unexpected ways. My new status as Marcus's intended bride had elevated their social position dramatically, and they were eager to maintain their connection to the Blackthorn family fortune and influence. Cordelia began treating me with the deference she might show to any powerful ally, consulting me on social decisions and asking my advice about family matters. It wasn't genuine affection, but it was a vast improvement over the systematic abuse I had endured for so long. Isadora had formed a relationship with Adrian Nightshade, a young vampire from a prominent family whose interests in modern art and cultural patronage matched her own aspirations perfectly. Evangeline had begun courting Sebastian Moonwood, heir to a vampire family that specialized in historical preservation and archival work. Both relationships had been facilitated by their association with me and their entrance into vampire society through my engagement to Marcus. They were genuinely grateful for the opportunities this had created and worked hard to demonstrate their loyalty and usefulness to the expanded family network. 6 months after the engagement party, Marcus formally proposed to me in the same garden where we had first spoken privately. He offered me a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a stunning piece featuring a large sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught moonlight and seemed to glow with its own internal fire. But more important than the ring were the words he spoke. He told me that he didn't want me to become someone else to fit into his world. He wanted me exactly as I was, complicated, intelligent, strong-willed, and absolutely unique. He promised that our marriage would be a partnership of equals, that my voice and choices would always matter, and that together we could build a future that honored both of our heritages. I accepted not because I needed to be rescued from my circumstances, but because I genuinely wanted to build a life with him. The fairy tale aspect wasn't about being saved by a prince. It was about finding someone who saw my true worth, respected my autonomy, and wanted to support me in becoming the person I was meant to be. Our wedding was held at the Blackthorn estate 1 year after our first meeting, with guests from both vampire and human society in attendance. It was a celebration that honored tradition while embracing the future, a perfect reflection of what our marriage represented. Cordelia, Isadora, and Evangeline were prominently featured as my family, their social status permanently elevated by their connection to the Blackthorn legacy. They had learned, perhaps for the first time, the advantages of treating family members with respect and consideration. Our relationships had evolved into something approaching genuine affection, built on mutual benefit and gradual understanding. But the most meaningful moment of the ceremony came when Marcus and I exchanged vows that we had written ourselves. Promises that went far beyond traditional marriage commitments. I promised to honor my dual heritage, to use my unique perspective to build bridges between communities that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding. I promised to never lose sight of who I was in the process of becoming what I could be. And I promised to face the future with courage, knowing that I had chosen this path freely and completely. Marcus promised to support my individual growth and ambitions, to never limit my choices or define my worth by his own standards. He promised to help me explore both sides of my heritage, to introduce me to communities and knowledge that would enrich my understanding of myself. And he promised to build a partnership based on equality, respect, and genuine love. As I stood in that beautiful garden, surrounded by people who valued and celebrated my unique identity, I thought about my father and the choices he had made to protect me. He had given me both human love and vampire heritage, ensuring that I would always have options regardless of what circumstances I faced. He had also left me clues, breadcrumbs of knowledge that led me to discover my true nature exactly when I was ready to embrace it. The research in his study, the photographs and documents, even his friendship with Marcus had all been carefully maintained so that I would have the resources I needed when the time came. My father had known that I would need to find my own path, make my own choices, and claim my identity on my own terms. He couldn't walk that journey for me, but he had ensured that I wouldn't have to walk it alone. Now I was using those gifts to create exactly the life I wanted, a marriage based on genuine partnership, a role in bridging vampire and human communities, and the freedom to define myself rather than accepting other people's limitations. Marcus and I spent our honeymoon traveling through Europe, visiting vampire communities in different countries, and learning about the diverse ways that vampire society had evolved across cultures. It was educational, romantic, and absolutely transformative. But Marcus also made time to ask about my own dreams and ambitions, what I wanted to accomplish with my new abilities, and the extended lifespan that came with my vampire heritage. He reminded me that becoming his wife didn't mean abandoning my individual goals, but rather gaining a partner who would support and encourage my personal growth. I told him that I wanted to continue my father's work, building bridges between human and vampire societies and helping other mixed heritage individuals navigate their own transformations. With my unique perspective and his family's resources, we could create programs that would benefit both communities, advancing knowledge and understanding in ways that had never been possible before. We talked about establishing a foundation dedicated to vampire-human cultural exchange, funding research into the history of both species, interactions, and creating safe spaces where mixed heritage individuals could find community and support. These weren't idle dreams. We returned from our honeymoon and immediately began implementing these plans, using Marcus's connections and resources to make genuine changes in how vampire and human societies understood each other. As we worked together on these projects, I realized that this was exactly what fairy tales were supposed to be about. Not passive waiting for rescue, but active creation of the future you deserve. Not changing yourself to fit someone else's expectations, but finding people who celebrate exactly who you are. The Cinderella story, in its original form, was never really about glass slippers or fairy godmothers. It was about a young woman who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her, who maintained her dignity and worth even in the most degrading circumstances, and who ultimately claimed the life she deserved through a combination of inner strength and fortunate timing. My story follows that same pattern, but with some crucial differences. I didn't wait passively for rescue. I educated myself about my heritage, even when that knowledge was incomplete and confusing. I maintained my sense of self even when I was being systematically erased from my own life. And when opportunity finally presented itself, I was ready to seize it with both hands. The glass slipper in my story wasn't a physical object at all. It was the knowledge of who I really was, the understanding of my heritage that allowed me to step into a life I had only imagined in dreams. Once I understood what I could become, everything else fell into place. And the prince, Marcus, wasn't looking for someone to rescue. He was looking for someone to build a kingdom with, someone whose unique perspective and abilities could help him transform vampire society in ways that had never been possible before. Sometimes the fairy tale isn't about being saved. Sometimes it's about being seen, recognized, and valued for exactly who you are. Sometimes the girl in the story doesn't need glass slippers to prove who she's meant to be. She just needs to stop accepting other people's definitions of her limitations and start writing her own destiny. This is my fairy tale, and I created it through my own choices and actions, with the support of someone who saw my true worth from the very beginning. I transformed from a servant in my own home to a bridge between two worlds, from someone invisible and powerless to someone whose voice and choices genuinely matter. The journey wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, fear, and overwhelming uncertainty. There were times when I questioned everything, wondered if I was making terrible mistakes, worried that I was losing myself in the process of transformation. But I learned that transformation doesn't mean losing yourself. It means discovering who you were always meant to be, peeling away the false limitations that others imposed, and revealing the person who was waiting underneath. I learned that power comes not from dominating others, but from understanding yourself deeply enough to make genuine choices about your future. I learned that love isn't about being rescued or completing someone else. It's about finding someone who respects your autonomy, celebrates your strengths, and supports you in becoming the fullest version of yourself. And I learned that fairy tales are real, but not in the way storybooks suggest. The real magic isn't in supernatural interventions or miraculous transformations. The real magic is in the courage to claim your own identity, the strength to refuse to accept limitations that don't serve you, and the wisdom to recognize genuine love when it appears. My name is Seraphina Blackthorn now, though I still carry the Ashwood name in my heart as a connection to my father and the human life I came from. I exist between two worlds, belonging fully to neither but drawing strength from both. I stand as proof that identity isn't binary, that you don't have to choose between different aspects of yourself, that the most powerful position is often the one that exists in the spaces between traditional categories. This is my story, my fairy tale, my life that I chose and created for myself. And if you find yourself in circumstances that feel impossibly limiting, if you feel trapped by other people's definitions of who you should be, If you've been told that your dreams are impossible or inappropriate or beyond your reach, I want you to remember something. The girl in the story didn't need glass slippers to prove her worth. She just needed to stop accepting other people's limitations and start writing her own destiny. Your fairy tale is waiting to be written, but only you can pick up the pen.